The encounter begins, an unlikely meeting. The airport buzzed with activity as travelers hurried through security lines, clutching their passports and tickets. It was a chilly winter morning in New York City, and the snow outside gave the airport a holiday-like glow. David Carter, a 35-year-old tech entrepreneur, was seated in the exclusive lounge of the first-class section, sipping on his espresso. His tailored suit, gleaming leather briefcase, and air of superiority gave off the impression of a man who had it all. David's rise to wealth had been meteoric. A few years ago, he had developed a breakthrough app that earned him millions, catapulting him into a world of luxury he once only dreamed of. But with success came a personality shift. David now saw the world as divided into two kinds of people, those who belonged in his league and those who didn't. He had no patience for what he called pretenders, people he assumed were out of place in high society. As David settled into his plush first-class seat aboard the flight to Los Angeles, he noticed an older man walking down the aisle. The man was dressed modestly, a plain jacket, a pair of worn-out sneakers, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. The contrast between the man and the polished interiors of first class was striking. David raised an eyebrow as the man stopped a few seats ahead of him and checked his ticket. "That can't be right," David muttered to himself. The man smiled warmly at the flight attendant, who directed him to the seat next to David's. David's irritation was immediate and visible. He leaned back, tapping his fingers on the armrest, as the man stored his bag in the overhead compartment and took his seat with a quiet, "Thank you." "Hello there," the man said, turning to David with a friendly grin. David forced a tight-lipped smile and nodded curtly. "Hi." He immediately looked away, pulling out his phone to avoid further interaction. In his mind, he was already constructing a narrative about the man. Perhaps he had won some contest or scraped together his life savings for this one extravagant experience. Either way, David felt certain the man didn't belong here. The plane took off smoothly, and the cabin lights dimmed to a comfortable glow. As the flight attendants began distributing drinks and snacks, David couldn't help but glance at his seatmate out of the corner of his eye. The man had pulled out a small, weathered notebook and was writing something with a pen that looked as old as the notebook itself. "What are you writing there?" David asked, unable to suppress his curiosity. His tone was more sarcastic than genuine. The man looked up, unfazed by David's demeanor. "Just jotting down some thoughts. Ideas for a project I'm working on." David smirked, leaning back in his seat. "A project, huh? Sounds important." "It is, to me," the man replied, his tone calm and unbothered. David chuckled softly and muttered under his breath, "Everyone's got a project these days." The flight attendant approached their row with a tray of drinks, and David ordered an expensive whiskey, making a point of emphasizing the brand. The man, on the other hand, simply asked for water. As they sipped their drinks, David couldn't resist prodding further. "So, what do you do? I mean, besides working on mysterious projects?" The man smiled, as if amused by David's tone. "Oh, I keep myself busy. I travel a lot, meet people, try to make a difference where I can." David raised an eyebrow. "Make a difference? Sounds vague. Are you one of those life coaches or something?" The man chuckled. "Not quite. But I suppose you could say I help people." David scoffed internally. Help people sounded like something someone would say when they didn't want to admit they were unemployed or aimless. For the next hour, David alternated between working on his laptop and stealing glances at the man, who remained quietly focused on his notebook. Occasionally, the man would pause to gaze out the window, a serene expression on his face, as though he found joy in simply being present. The calm demeanor of his seatmate only irritated David further. In his world, success was loud and flashy. It was tailored suits, luxury watches, and exclusive first-class lounges. This man, with his outdated clothes and humble presence, didn't fit the image of someone who belonged here. David couldn't resist one final jab. Let me guess, he said, leaning toward the man. You saved up for years to treat yourself to this flight, right? The man turned to him, his eyes warm but tinged with a hint of sadness. Actually, no. But it's a long story. David leaned back, satisfied that he had hit a nerve, and returned to his laptop, feeling smug. Little did he know, the long story the man mentioned was about to change everything. The mockery begins, a clash of worlds. The cabin settled into a quiet hum as passengers adjusted to the long flight. David, still pretending to be engrossed in his laptop, couldn't stop thinking about the man seated beside him. It wasn't anger that drove him, it was something more petty, a need to reaffirm his belief that he was superior to anyone he deemed out of place. Thomas, as David had learned from the small tag stitched on the man's notebook, was scribbling again. His pen moved deliberately, pausing every so often as if he were deep in thought. The sight of him, calm, collected, and seemingly oblivious to the unspoken tension, irked David. Finally, unable to restrain himself, David leaned over. You know, he said, his tone dripping with condescension, you might find it easier to type that on a laptop. Saves you from carrying around, whatever that is. He gestured vaguely at Thomas's notebook. Thomas didn't look up right away. He finished the sentence he was writing, closed the notebook carefully, and smiled. I've always preferred pen and paper. Helps me think more clearly. David smirked, shaking his head. Old school, huh? That's rare these days. But hey, if it works for you, he trailed off, his words laced with sarcasm. Thomas didn't bite. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out a pack of gum. He unwrapped a piece and, after popping it into his mouth, held the pack out to David. Would you like one? David stared at the offered gum as though it were an alien artifact. No, thanks, he said curtly. I'm good. Suit yourself, Thomas said cheerfully, tucking the gum back into his bag. David couldn't decide if Thomas's politeness was genuine or calculated. It was almost as though the man were challenging him by refusing to engage in any sort of hostility. That thought alone made David even more determined to assert his superiority. So, this project, you mentioned earlier, David began, his voice casual but probing, what kind of project are we talking about? Are you writing a book? Planning an event? Starting a charity? The last word came out with a hint of derision, as though David couldn't imagine someone like Thomas being involved in anything significant. Thomas chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It's a bit of everything, really. I like to keep busy. David rolled his eyes. Right. A bit of everything. That's not vague at all. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and pressed further. So, do you do this for a living, or is this more of a side hustle? Thomas paused for a moment, then looked David directly in the eyes. I suppose you could say it's a passion. Something that keeps me grounded. Grounded? David repeated, his tone skeptical. That's an interesting choice of words. Most people in first class are aiming for the sky, not trying to stay grounded. Thomas smiled again, as if he found David's comment amusing. Well, I guess I see things differently. David's patience was wearing thin. He wasn't used to people deflecting his questions or, worse, making him feel like the one missing the point. To him, this whole exchange was a waste of time, but something about Thomas's quiet confidence kept him engaged, even if it was just to prove to himself that the man was out of his depth. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. You know, I've met a lot of people who talk big about their passions and their projects. But in the end, it's usually just a way to make themselves feel important. Thomas tilted his head slightly, as though considering David's words. That's an interesting perspective, he said finally. But I think what matters is what we leave behind, not how others perceive it. David couldn't help but laugh. That sounds like something you'd find on a motivational poster. At that moment, the flight attendant arrived to take their dinner orders. David, still riding the high of his perceived intellectual victory, ordered the most expensive meal option with an air of entitlement. When it was Thomas's turn, he asked for something simple, a salad and a cup of herbal tea. As the flight attendant left, David seized the opportunity to jab again. Salad and tea. That's a modest choice for someone flying first class. Thomas shrugged. It's what I like. No need to complicate things. David shook his head, smirking. You're a fascinating guy, Thomas. Really. Most people up here are, CEOs, investors, maybe a few celebrities. You don't exactly fit the mold. Thomas's expression didn't change. What mold would that be? David said, gesturing vaguely, the kind of person who belongs in first class. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in Thomas's eyes, not anger, but a quiet strength that made David feel uneasy. And what does someone who belongs in first class look like to you? David hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Well, I mean, people who've earned it. Successful people. Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze steady. And how do you measure success? The question hung in the air like a challenge. David opened his mouth to reply but found himself at a loss for words. The flight attendant returned with their meals, breaking the tension. David attacked his food with gusto, determined to avoid any more of Thomas's philosophical musings. As the meal went on, David noticed that Thomas barely touched his food. Instead, he spent most of the time gazing out the window, lost in thought. It was infuriating. How could someone so out of place be so calm? The silence between them stretched on, but David's mind was racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Thomas than met the eye. But for now, he convinced himself that he was just being overly curious about someone who didn't matter. Enjoy your meal, David said finally, his tone dripping with insincerity. Thomas looked at him, his smile as warm and genuine as ever. Thank you. I hope you enjoy yours too. David turned away, annoyed by the man's unshakable composure. Little did he know, this seemingly ordinary stranger would soon teach him the most extraordinary lesson of his life. A quiet dignity, the power of restraint. The hum of the airplane engines provided a soothing backdrop to the cabin, but for David, the silence between him and Thomas had become unbearable. He couldn't quite understand why. Maybe it was because Thomas's presence felt oddly significant. Despite his modest appearance and calm demeanor, the man seemed to exude a quiet confidence that unnerved David. David took another sip of his whiskey, his gaze darting toward Thomas, who had resumed writing in his notebook. The man seemed completely absorbed in his thoughts, unbothered by David's earlier attempts at mockery. Still writing, huh? David asked, his voice breaking the silence. Thomas looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. Always. It helps me process things. David leaned back in his seat, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. You must have a lot to process, then, he said, his tone light but tinged with sarcasm. Thomas chuckled softly. We all do, don't we? There it was again, that ability to deflect without dismissing, to respond without engaging in hostility. It irritated David more than outright confrontation would have. He wasn't used to people like Thomas, people who seemed immune to his sharp words and probing questions. You're an interesting guy, Thomas, David said, setting his glass down on the tray table. Most people would have snapped back by now. You don't seem the type to let things get under your skin. Thomas paused for a moment, as if considering his response. I learned a long time ago that how others treat you often has more to do with them than with you. Holding on to anger doesn't serve anyone. David raised an eyebrow. That's philosophical. It's practical, Thomas corrected gently. It makes life easier. David laughed, shaking his head. You've got an answer for everything, don't you? Not everything, Thomas admitted. Just the things that matter. For a brief moment, David found himself wondering what kind of life experiences could shape someone into being so unshakable. But he quickly pushed the thought aside, unwilling to delve deeper into a man he had already decided was beneath him. As the flight attendants began clearing away dinner trays, a young woman seated across the aisle leaned over toward Thomas. "Excuse me," she said shyly. "I couldn't help but notice your notebook. Are you a writer?" Thomas turned to her with a warm smile. "Of sorts," he said. "I write down ideas, observations, things I find meaningful." The woman's face lit up. "That's wonderful. I love journaling, but I can never seem to stay consistent with it. Do you have any tips?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Write what feels important to you. Don't worry about being consistent, just focus on being honest." The woman nodded, her admiration evident. "Thank you. That's really helpful." David watched the interaction with growing frustration. He couldn't believe how easily Thomas connected with people. Even his vague, almost generic advice seemed to resonate. It was infuriating. As the woman turned back to her seat, Thomas glanced at David and smiled. "She reminded me of my granddaughter. Always curious, always eager to learn." "You have a granddaughter?" David asked, unable to hide his surprise. Thomas nodded. "Two, actually. They're my greatest joy." David blinked, momentarily disarmed. He hadn't expected such a personal detail, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a pang of guilt for how dismissive he'd been. But he quickly buried the feeling, leaning back in his seat and crossing his arms. "So, let me guess," David said, his voice regaining its edge. "You're one of those family guys who believes in living a simple life, right? No interest in success, no ambition to climb the ladder." Thomas smiled, unbothered by the jab. "I wouldn't say that. I've worked hard in my life, and I've been fortunate in many ways. But success, to me, isn't about climbing a ladder. It's about how many people you lift up along the way." The words hung in the air like a challenge. David opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. He wasn't sure if it was Thomas's calm tone or the weight of his words that left him speechless. "Excuse me, sir," the flight attendant interrupted, addressing Thomas. "Would you like anything else to drink?" Thomas shook his head politely. "No, thank you. But I appreciate you checking." The flight attendant lingered for a moment, her expression warm. "I just wanted to say, it's an honor to have you on board. I've read about your work, and it's truly inspiring." David's ears perked up. He turned to Thomas, his curiosity piqued. "Your work? What does she mean by that?" Thomas looked slightly embarrassed, waving off the comment. "It's nothing, really. Just some things I've been fortunate enough to be a part of." But David wasn't about to let it go. "No, seriously. What is it you do? What kind of work gets a flight attendant calling it inspiring?" Thomas hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he said, "I've spent the last few decades working on projects to help underserved communities, building schools, creating job opportunities, things like that." David stared at him, his mind racing. For the first time, he didn't know what to say. He had spent the entire flight assuming Thomas was a nobody, someone who didn't belong in first class. But now, his assumptions were beginning to crumble. "That's impressive," David said finally, though his tone lacked sincerity. Thomas simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you. But it's not about being impressive. It's about doing what feels right." As the flight continued, David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Thomas than he had initially thought. The man's quiet dignity, his refusal to engage in petty arguments, and his apparent humility all pointed to a life far more meaningful than David had assumed. And yet, David still couldn't bring himself to fully admit that he might have been wrong. But soon, the truth would reveal itself in a way that would leave him no choice. The turning point, when the truth unfolds. The flight was well into its journey, with the horizon outside glowing in hues of orange and purple. The passengers in first class had grown quiet, some working, others lost in thought or lulled into naps. David, however, was restless. Something about Thomas gnawed him. The man's humility and calmness didn't match the narrative David had crafted in his head. He had pegged Thomas as an outsider, a man out of his league in the luxury of first class. But the flight attendant's comment about Thomas's inspiring work lingered in David's mind. Underserved communities. Schools. David muttered under his breath, replaying Thomas's words. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Must be exaggerating. But as he glanced at Thomas, who sat quietly flipping through his notebook, David couldn't suppress his curiosity. So, these schools you mentioned, David said, his tone feigning nonchalance. How many are we talking about? A couple. A handful? Thomas looked up from his notebook, his expression thoughtful. The last time I checked, it was a little over 200. David choked on the sip of water he had just taken. 200, he repeated, his voice louder than he intended. Thomas nodded, as if the number were nothing out of the ordinary. Yes. But it's not just about the number, it's about the lives they've impacted. Each school represents a chance for children to dream beyond their circumstances. David stared at him, his disbelief turning into suspicion. 200 schools. That sounds ambitious. Who's funding all this? Thomas smiled faintly. I am, along with donations from people who believe in the cause. David's eyebrows shot up. You're funding it? How? Before Thomas could respond, a gentle chime rang through the cabin, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and I'd like to take a moment to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. I also have a special announcement. David sat up straighter, intrigued. We are honored to have a very special passenger aboard our flight today, Mr. Thomas Gray. Mr. Gray has dedicated his life to humanitarian work, building schools and creating opportunities for thousands of children around the world. His tireless efforts have changed countless lives, and it's a privilege to have him with us. The announcement was followed by a ripple of applause from the cabin. Passengers turned to look at Thomas, some murmuring their admiration. David's jaw dropped. He turned to Thomas, who looked slightly embarrassed by the attention but smiled graciously and nodded to the applauding passengers. You've got to be kidding me, David muttered, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The flight attendant who had praised Thomas earlier returned to their row, her face glowing with admiration. Mr. Gray, on behalf of the crew, I just want to thank you again for everything you do. It's truly inspiring to have someone like you aboard. Thomas gave her a humble smile. Thank you. That means a lot. As the flight attendant walked away, David was left speechless. His mind raced as he pieced together everything he had observed about Thomas during the flight. The man he had mocked for being out of place in first class was not only more successful than David could have imagined but was using his success to better the lives of others. Wait a minute, David said, his voice breaking the silence. You're that Thomas Gray? The philanthropist? The guy who's always in the news for building schools and hospitals? Thomas turned to him, his smile modest. I don't know about always in the news, but yes, I suppose that's me. David's face flushed with embarrassment. He had spent the entire flight looking down on a man who had achieved more than David ever could, achievements not measured in wealth or material success but in the lives he had touched. For the first time in years, David was at a loss for words. The cabin reacts. Around them, other passengers began whispering among themselves. A man across the aisle leaned over to shake Thomas's hand. I've read about you, Mr. Gray. Your work in Africa is extraordinary. It's an honor to meet you. Thank you, Thomas said warmly. But it's not just my work. It's the effort of countless people who believe in the same vision. David couldn't help but notice how easily Thomas deflected praise, redirecting it toward others. It was a stark contrast to the way David had always sought recognition for his achievements. The whispers grew louder as more passengers realized who Thomas was. A woman a few rows ahead turned around, holding up her phone. I can't believe I'm on the same flight as the Thomas Gray. My sister's a teacher, and your school programs have been a huge inspiration for her. Thomas smiled graciously. That's wonderful to hear. Please thank her for the important work she does. David sank lower in his seat, his mind swirling with regret and self-recrimination. He had spent the entire flight judging Thomas, assuming he was someone small and insignificant. And yet, here was a man whose humility and kindness had earned him the admiration of strangers, not for his wealth or status but for his impact on the world. For the first time in his life, David felt ashamed. Not just of his actions during the flight but of the person he had become. A moment of reflection. As the flight continued, David found himself unusually quiet. He replayed every snide remark he had made to Thomas, every dismissive look, every assumption. And with each memory, his shame deepened. When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, David turned to Thomas. Listen, he said, his voice hesitant. I owe you an apology. I've been out of line. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I'm sorry. Thomas looked at him, his eyes kind. Thank you, David. That means a lot. But don't be too hard on yourself. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we learn from them. David nodded, his throat tight. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine desire to change, not for the sake of appearances but because he wanted to be better. As the plane touched down, David couldn't help but wonder if meeting Thomas Gray was more than a coincidence. Maybe it was the wake-up call he didn't know he needed. David's regret, the weight of reflection. The airplane touched down with a gentle thud, and a collective sigh of relief passed through the cabin as passengers began preparing to disembark. For most, it was just another flight. For David, it was the longest 3 hours of his life, and not for the reasons he expected. He sat in his seat, frozen in thought, while passengers around him unbuckled their seatbelts and reached for their carry-on bags. Thomas, seated beside him, moved with the same quiet efficiency he had shown throughout the flight. There was no rush, no urgency, just an unshakable sense of calm. David's mind raced as he watched Thomas zip up his worn backpack and carefully tuck his notebook inside. The simplicity of the man's actions was disarming, especially now that David understood the scope of what Thomas had achieved in his life. For years, David had built his identity around being the best, the wealthiest, the most successful person in the room. He measured his worth by the zeros in his bank account, the exclusivity of his possessions, and the admiration, or envy, of others. But sitting next to Thomas, David felt small, smaller than he ever had in his life. He couldn't shake the memory of his own words earlier in the flight, "You don't exactly fit the mold of someone who belongs in first class." The irony hit him like a punch to the gut. Thomas didn't just belong in first class, he belonged at the head of the table, in any room, anywhere in the world. And yet, he carried himself with a humility that David had never seen in someone of his stature. The long walk. As the plane taxied to the gate, David found himself fidgeting. He wanted to say something, anything, to Thomas, but every sentence he rehearsed in his head sounded hollow. What could he possibly say to undo the hours of arrogance and judgment he had directed at the man? The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers began filing out of the plane. Thomas stood, slinging his modest backpack over one shoulder, and turned to David. "It was nice chatting with you," Thomas said, his smile genuine. "Take care, David." David scrambled to his feet, his voice catching in his throat. "Wait," he blurted out. Thomas paused, looking at him expectantly. David hesitated, then said, I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything. For the way I acted, the things I said. He stopped, searching for the right word. Wrong. About everything. Thomas studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his eyes kind. Thank you. Apologies are never easy to give, but they're important. And don't worry, I've been wrong plenty of times in my life. It's how we learn. David nodded, his chest tight. He wanted to say more, but Thomas's gentle acceptance of his apology made it clear that no grand gesture or speech was necessary. They began walking down the aisle together, though David hung back slightly, giving Thomas the space he deserved. As they reached the jet bridge, David noticed how other passengers turned to Thomas with quiet admiration. Some shook his hand, others simply nodded in acknowledgement. David couldn't help but feel like an outsider. For the first time, he understood that wealth and status didn't earn respect, character did. And in that regard, Thomas was leagues ahead of him. A lesson in perspective. As they stepped into the bustling terminal, David felt the weight of his regret grow heavier. He had spent years cultivating an image of success, but in just a few hours, Thomas had shown him the emptiness of his pursuits. Thomas, for his part, didn't seem burdened by the same sense of finality. He moved through the terminal with the same quiet confidence he had displayed on the flight, pausing occasionally to help an elderly woman with her bag or to direct a lost traveler. David followed him at a distance, unsure why he couldn't just let the man go. Something inside him wanted to hold on to this moment, to learn more, to understand the man who had so effortlessly turned his world upside down. Finally, as they approached the baggage claim, David summoned the courage to speak again. Thomas, he said, stepping closer. Thomas turned, his expression patient. I need to know, David began, his voice hesitant. How do you do it? How do you live like that? So calm, he gestured vaguely. Content. Don't you ever feel like you should want more? Thomas tilted his head slightly, as though considering the question. Want more of what? David opened his mouth to respond but realized he didn't have a clear answer. More money. More fame. More recognition. None of it seemed significant anymore. Thomas smiled, as if he understood David's internal struggle. I think it comes down to knowing what enough means to you. For me, it's about the impact I leave behind. Every school we build, every child who gets an education, that's enough. It's more than enough. David swallowed hard, his throat tight. He felt like a child being taught a lesson he should have learned years ago. And you don't ever feel resentful? David asked, his voice quieter. I mean, giving so much and not expecting anything in return. Thomas shook his head. When you give without expecting anything, you're free. Free from disappointment, free from resentment. It's a good way to live. David nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He realized he had spent his entire life chasing things, money, power, admiration, because he believed they would bring him freedom. But now, he saw that true freedom came from letting go. The fork in the road. As Thomas retrieved his luggage, he turned back to David. It was good meeting you, David. I hope our paths cross again someday. David hesitated, then extended his hand. Thank you, Thomas. For everything. You've given me a lot to think about. Thomas shook his hand firmly, his grip warm and steady. Take care of yourself, David. And remember, it's never too late to change. With that, Thomas walked away, blending into the sea of travelers. David stood there for a long moment, watching him go. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing at a crossroads. He could continue on the path he had been on, chasing empty goals and superficial success. Or he could choose something different, something meaningful. As the terminal bustled around him, David made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know where the road would lead, but he was determined to find out. A new perspective, the seeds of change. David sat in the back seat of his luxury town car as it weaved through the busy streets of Los Angeles. The city's endless hum of life, honking cars, towering billboards, and glittering skyscrapers, seemed muted, distant, almost irrelevant to him now. His thoughts were stuck on the man he had just met, Thomas Gray. For years, David had been on a treadmill of ambition. The startup he had built from scratch was now a multi-million-dollar company, a success story that many envied. He had the house, the car, the lifestyle he once dreamed of, but after his encounter with Thomas, it all felt hollow. As he stared out the window, his driver asked, "Long flight, sir?" David blinked, pulled from his thoughts. "Yeah, you could say that," he replied absently, his voice lacking its usual confidence. For the first time in a long while, David felt vulnerable. The encounter with Thomas had been a mirror, reflecting not just the gaps in his character but the gaps in his life. The man's words played on a loop in his head, "It's about how many people you lift up along the way." He had spent years climbing the proverbial ladder, but who had he lifted up? Who had he truly helped along the way? The uncomfortable truth was no one, not really. His success had been for himself, his wealth used to insulate himself from the very struggles Thomas worked tirelessly to alleviate. The car pulled into the driveway of his sprawling Los Angeles mansion. As the gates closed behind him, David couldn't help but feel trapped. The opulence of his home, once a symbol of his achievements, now seemed suffocating. Unearthing the truth about Thomas. That night, sleep evaded him. Instead of retreating to his usual distractions, streaming shows, answering emails, or scrolling through social media, David found himself sitting in his dimly lit study, his laptop glowing in front of him. He hesitated for a moment, then typed "Thomas Gray" into the search bar. The results were overwhelming. Article after article detailed Thomas's humanitarian work, his relentless efforts to build schools in underprivileged communities, and his advocacy for education as a universal right. David clicked on a video interview. On the screen, Thomas sat across from a journalist, his demeanor as calm and warm as it had been on the flight. "Mr. Gray," the journalist began, "you've dedicated decades of your life to this cause. What drives you to keep going?" Thomas smiled. "It's the faces of the children. When you see a child walk into a classroom for the first time, knowing they have a chance to dream bigger, to hope for a better future, it's priceless. It reminds me why this work matters." David leaned back in his chair, feeling a lump form in his throat. He clicked on another article that recounted Thomas's backstory, how he had grown up in poverty, working odd jobs to put himself through school. How a single act of kindness, a stranger paying his first semester's tuition, had set him on a path of success and service. One line in particular struck David: "Thomas Gray believes that the greatest currency in life is the impact you leave behind, not the money you make." David closed the laptop, his chest tight. He thought about his own life, his own success, and how it had been built on a foundation of self-interest. He had wealth, but what impact had he made? A decision to act. The next morning, David woke up with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain: he needed to change. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number of his assistant. "Jessica," he said when she answered, "clear my schedule for the next week. I need time to recalibrate." Jessica sounded surprised. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Is everything okay?" David hesitated. "It will be," he said finally. His next call was to Thomas. He had asked for the man's contact information before they parted ways, and now he was grateful for it. The phone rang twice before Thomas answered. "Hello, this is Thomas." "Hi, Thomas. It's David, from the flight." "David," Thomas said warmly. "Good to hear from you. How are you?" David took a deep breath. I'm figuring things out. Listen, I've been thinking a lot about what you said on the plane. About impact. And I realize I've been living my life all wrong. Thomas chuckled softly. I don't know if there's a wrong way to live, David. We're all just doing the best we can. Maybe, David said, but I know I can do better. I want to learn from you, Thomas. I want to see what you do, how you make such a difference. I want to help. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Thomas spoke again, his tone was thoughtful. That's a big step, David. Are you sure you're ready for it? David nodded, even though Thomas couldn't see him. I am. I need this. All right, Thomas said. There's a project I'm visiting next week. It's one of the schools we've built in Mexico. If you're serious, meet me there. David felt a surge of determination. I'll be there. The journey to Mexico. A week later, David found himself on a small, bumpy bus winding its way through a rural village in Mexico. The landscape was a stark contrast to the glitz and glamour of Los Angeles, dirt roads, modest homes, and children playing barefoot in the streets. Thomas was waiting for him at the entrance to a small school painted in bright, cheerful colors. The two men greeted each other with a handshake, and Thomas immediately introduced David to the teachers, the students, and the volunteers who kept the school running. As the day went on, David watched in awe as Thomas interacted with everyone, children and adults alike, with the same warmth and respect he had shown on the plane. He saw the joy in the children's faces, the gratitude in the eyes of the teachers, and the sense of hope that permeated the air. For the first time, David understood what it meant to make a real impact. A lesson in kindness, the start of a new legacy. David stood at the edge of the small, colorful schoolyard in rural Mexico, watching the children play under the midday sun. Their laughter echoed in the air, a symphony of pure joy. It was infectious, so much so that David couldn't help but smile, something he hadn't done genuinely in years. He had spent the last 2 days shadowing Thomas Gray, the man he had once mocked and dismissed as a nobody on that fateful first-class flight. Now, standing here amidst the fruits of Thomas's labor, David felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The school was small but vibrant. It had classrooms with hand-painted murals, shelves filled with books, and teachers who were deeply passionate about their work. But what struck David the most wasn't the infrastructure, it was the spirit of the people who made this place come alive. Witnessing impact. On the second morning of his visit, David joined Thomas for a tour of the village surrounding the school. The roads were dusty, the homes modest, and yet the people they met greeted them with warmth and gratitude. As they walked, a young boy ran up to Thomas, clutching a piece of paper. Senor Gray. Look, the boy said, holding up what appeared to be a drawing. Thomas knelt down, his face lighting up. What's this, Miguel? It's my dream, the boy said shyly. The paper showed a crudely drawn airplane and a stick figure wearing a pilot's hat. You want to be a pilot? Thomas asked, his voice full of encouragement. Miguel nodded enthusiastically. Yes. I want to fly all over the world. Thomas ruffled the boy's hair. And you will, Miguel. You just keep studying and dreaming big. The boy grinned and ran off, clutching his drawing like a treasure. David, who had been watching silently, felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time he had spoken to someone, especially a child, with such sincerity and belief. You know he might not become a pilot, right? David said, more as a question than a challenge. Thomas stood, his gaze following the boy as he disappeared into the distance. Maybe. But that's not the point. The point is that he believes he can. And that belief? It's the seed of everything. It's what changes lives. David nodded, unable to argue. He had spent so much of his life chasing certainty, results, profits, tangible success, that he had forgotten the power of something as simple as hope. David's awakening. By the end of the second day, David found himself sitting alone on a bench in the schoolyard, staring at the sunset. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the distant chatter of children heading home. Thomas joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to David and took a seat beside him. "Long day?" Thomas asked, a small smile on his face. David let out a dry laugh. "That's an understatement. This is a lot to process." Thomas sipped his coffee, waiting patiently for David to continue. "I thought I had everything figured out," David admitted. "I built a company, made more money than I ever thought possible, surrounded myself with all the things people dream of. But now, standing here, it all feels empty." Thomas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, giving David the space to wrestle with his thoughts. "I spent years looking down on people," David continued, his voice quieter now. "Judging them, assuming they weren't good enough, weren't ambitious enough. But now I see how wrong I was. You've done more with your life than I ever could, and you've done it without needing recognition or validation. How do you do it?" Thomas looked at him, his expression gentle. "You're asking the wrong question, David. It's not about how I do it, it's about why." David frowned. "Why, then?" Thomas set his coffee down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I know what it feels like to have nothing. To dream of something better but not know if it's possible. Someone once gave me a chance, a stranger who believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. I promised that if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same for others." David stared at him, the weight of Thomas's words sinking in. A new path. That night, as David prepared to leave the village, Thomas handed him a small, worn notebook. "What's this?" David asked. Thomas smiled. "It's blank. I thought you might want to start writing your own ideas down. Sometimes, putting things on paper helps you see them more clearly." David hesitated, then took the notebook. "Thanks. I think I'll need it." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Remember, it's not about where you start, it's about where you go from here." The next morning, as David boarded his flight back to Los Angeles, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Months later, back in his office, surrounded by the sleek, modern trappings of his success, David sat at his desk, flipping through the notebook Thomas had given him. It was no longer blank. The pages were filled with ideas for how he could use his wealth and influence to make a difference. He had started small, funding scholarships for underprivileged students, but his vision was growing. He wanted to build schools, create opportunities, and give others the same chance that had changed Thomas's life. For the first time, David felt like his work mattered, not because it made him richer or more powerful, but because it had the potential to lift others up. The legacy begins. 6 months after his visit to Mexico, David invited Thomas to the opening of his first funded school in Los Angeles. As they stood together at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, David turned to Thomas. "This wouldn't have happened without you," David said. Thomas shook his head. "It's not about me, David. It's about what you chose to do. And I think you're just getting started." As the ribbon was cut and the crowd applauded, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: fulfillment. He realized that success wasn't about how much you had, it was about how much you gave. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly successful. The end.